Hey everyone, Michael from Xano here. I've got a really great tutorial for you today, and it's going to cover Google Sheets API, specifically how you can consume a spreadsheet in Google Sheets to actually add that data or update that data to a Xano database, right? So Xano can be that source of truth. Now, we know a lot of people work with Google Sheets API for a variety of reasons. I'm going to use a sample data set of 1,000 leads today, show you how you can call that data, what you need to know about the Google Sheets API, and then how to format that data in Xano and actually add it to a database. Now, there's also a lot of nuance that is involved. Not one spreadsheet is created equally. So this is really designed to be sort of used as a base layer or a foundation so you can adapt and expand upon it depending on your needs. So I'm going to actually do a live build instead of just talking through the logic. So this video will be a little bit longer. We'll make sure to have different chapters in there so you can kind of skip through what you care about most, but it is going to be comprehensive for this sort of base layer use case, but we hope you find it helpful. So just kind of reviewing what we'll cover. First and foremost, you'll need to authenticate with Google, and we're going to use a Google Service account to actually do that. And we have a snippet that I put together. There's a separate tutorial on how to go about setting up a Google Service account with the Google Cloud Console. So that's going to actually be a prereq. That's not going to be covered in this tutorial. So if you need to know how to set that up, please go find that. We'll make sure to link it up in the video description. We'll show you a couple things once that's set up, what you need to know for your Xano workspace, a couple things about enabling the Google Sheets API and that Google Service account, but then we'll be off and running with the Google Sheets API. So once again, that I will go through. It's specifically, this tutorial is about getting a Google Sheet. And then once again, I'm going to actually build to talk about some different nuance to look through. So you will probably end up wanting to adapt this snippet or use case depending on how your Google Sheet actually looks. So I'm going to talk about what's some things there that you might want to look out for. And also, last but not least, when you are building something like this where you are consuming a lot of data, adding or updating a database, typically designed to be used in a background task, which is used to handle large data processing over time, right? So keep that in mind as well. We'll talk about that in the video. But I think you'll find this helpful. We know Google Sheets API is super popular amongst everyone, right? It's such a handy tool. I mean, I use Google Docs, Google Sheets all the time in my day-to-day. So if you have some data in there and you're wondering, well, how the heck do I get it into Xano? Well, this tutorial will be for you. All right, so now that we're in Xano, the first thing we need to do is install that Google Service account snippet. And if you're looking for instruction on how to get that set up and started, please go and check out the tutorial for that. That's a whole nother beast. So I've installed this Google Service account into my instance. Now my workspace, I need to configure it. So if you go to settings here, you'll see there's a couple environment variables that we need to configure. I need to get my Google JSON key from that service account, and then I need to define the scopes for that service account. So if I go to my Google Cloud Console here, I already have this service account set up. You can see I call it service account example. Let me go to my project settings, then to service accounts. And here on the actions, I'm going to go ahead and select manage keys. And I want to add a brand new key here. I'll hit create new key. We want the recommended JSON key. Remember, that's what I asked for too in the environment variable. And then I'll hit create. And that should download a JSON key for me. And I can go ahead and open that. And when I do, for my computer, it happens to default for opening that into my Firefox browser here. I'm just going to select raw data and select all this and copy this. And let's go back into Xano now. And right here, we're asked for that Google JSON key. I'm just going to paste that in. We can hit import. We don't need to, though. Next, we need our scopes. But before we do that, there is one more thing that we need to make sure that we have set up in our Google Service account, and that is to enable the API service that we're going to call, which is Google Sheets. So let me jump back to that Google Cloud Console here, and I'm just going to search for APIs and services and go to this API and services page. And right here at the top, you can see we can enable APIs and services. If you don't do this, you'll be met with a basically permission denied error. Because your Google Service account won't have this specific API enabled. So welcome to the API library here. I can just search for, let's do sheet, and there's our Google Sheets API. And now I can enable this. And once that's enabled, we're good there. So back to Xano, remember we need scopes now. So I'll make sure to link up this page here in the snippet, but if you just Google search for Google API scopes, you'll find this page here with all these different, all the scopes really necessary for all the Google APIs. So I need Google Sheets API, and you can see here's a group of them. For this one, we're gonna grab this googleapis.com/auth/spreadsheets. This just gives me reading, edit, creating, and deleting for my Google Sheet spreadsheet. Today, we're really only gonna be reading a Google Sheet, but this will give you full access in case you need to expand upon this snippet for your own use case. So let's go back into scopes here, and let's paste this in and hit save. Okay, awesome. So we have our Google Service account configured so we can actually authenticate to call Google Sheets API. Let's jump over to the library and functions. And here's that Google Service account token, access token function that was included in our snippet. And we can just give this a little test run here, and we should be getting a token back here, which we'll use to pass in the header of the Google Sheets API endpoint. So let's go ahead and start to build that. So I'm going to add a new function here, and we'll call this, we'll say Google Sheet API. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And so the first thing we need to do actually is call that Google Service Account Access token. So we already have that custom built, right? I just ran that. So if we go to our function stack, then go to custom functions, there's that Google Service Account token. And the output here, I'll just go ahead and call this token. Great. So that is step one. Now, let's go ahead and actually call our Google Sheet spreadsheet, right? So how do we do that? Well, first of all, let's take a quick look at the spreadsheet we're going to use. This is just a sample spreadsheet of 1,000 leads here, all sample data, so none of this is sensitive data. And I'll link up where I found this spreadsheet if you want to use it. Of course, there'll be some sample data in the snippet. But if we navigate over to the Google Sheets API documentation, in order to call a specific spreadsheet, we have this endpoint here. And it's a get method, and we're calling a spreadsheet based on the spreadsheet ID. So let me go ahead, I'm going to actually copy this here. And you can see there's a place to input that spreadsheet ID right there in the URL. And let's come back to Xano here. And I'm going to add an external API request. It's already on get, so that's great. Let's paste this in. And you can see my URL is a little cut off, but if I hit Shift Enter, I can open up and see the entire thing. So here at the very end, right, we have spreadsheet ID, but we actually need to put in the ID of whatever spreadsheet we're going to call. However, I want to make sure that this whole function is adaptable for your use case. So let's go ahead and put in here, I'm going to do %s. And not 5s, actually %s here, and hit save, and then add a filter at the end. Call this sprintf. So sprintf will look for that that character %s, and it'll substitute it with whatever argument I put in here, right? And so we want to make this dynamic. We don't have an input or variable to put in there just yet. Let's go ahead and hit save, and let's go back to my Google spreadsheet. And if I drag down so you can see my address bar here, well, now you can see here at the top, here is my URL for the spreadsheet. And right here after this /d, where this next slash starts, you see 19 here, what I'm going to highlight. That's going to be your spreadsheet ID. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then just drag my screen back up. But let's jump over back to Xano. And for testing purposes, I'm going to actually store this in a variable for now. And we'll call this variable spreadsheet ID, and I'll make sure it's before we actually call that external API. And I'm just going to paste and hard code my value in here, right? And hit save. And let's go back into here and let's add that argument, which is that variable I just created. Hit update. And with this variable text substitution, you can get this from any variable in your function stack, whether that's coming from an external source, database, hard-coded in, a dynamic input, however you need to substitute in that spreadsheet ID. But for now, because I'm going to be running this a few times as we go here, I'm going to just store this in a variable. Awesome. Almost there. One other thing that we need to do is we need to use this token for our authorization method, right? So here in the headers, I'm going to go ahead and hit push. And I'm going to type in here authorization :bearer. And then I'm going to use that %s method again. And I can find my %sign, %s, with my sprintf filter. And here I'm going to add in that token from my first function, which is calling that Google Service account, and hit update. And I just happen to know from the Google Sheets API documentation, this is the method they prefer. Of course, always read whatever external API you're working with, the documentation for how they authenticate. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and hit save. And let's see what we get so far. So let's hit update. And if I run this, you think we should be good to go, right? But what we'll see is I'm getting this permission denied error, right? Well, think about when you're working with a Google Doc or Google Sheets, you have a functionality in there which allows you to actually share that sheet either with anyone, right? You can make it completely public, or with specific people. What's interesting about the Google Service account is you actually get an email associated with it. So we're going to want to share this Google Sheet with that email address. So if I just simply come back to my Google Service account on my Google Cloud Console, you can see right here, here is the email associated with my Google Service account. So if I just come back to, my spreadsheet here and paste in that email, we can go ahead and give my Google Service account actual access to this spreadsheet. So now if we run this again, we should see something slightly different, and we're actually getting results back, right? So great. All right, here we go. We can see some format, the title, etc., etc. But what am I not getting back right now? I'm not getting back the grid data, right? And this is the actual data we want to work with to store in our Xano database. So let's go back and double check that that API documentation for get spreadsheet. And you can see here there's a parameter, include grid data to true if we want all that information. So let's go ahead and mark that as true. So I'm going to just copy that parameter name. Let's come back into my external API request, and in the param section here, I'm going to use the set method, and the path will be the actual name of that parameter, and our value here is going to be true because we want to get all that grid data back. And I'll hit update, I'll hit save, and if we rerun this, well, now let's go ahead and look at some of these results. So here's our properties, which we already got, and then we see sheets, and here is our data, row data, values. And you will see that there will be this values array, and each one of them will have the row data. So you can see this effective or formatted value here, 1. So you can see that is right there. This is the second values array. We scroll down. You can see here is this account ID. Here is the, I believe, the lead owner, etc., etc. So that is all contained in these various values array, as you see across the row, right? So this very first one is going to have index, which is the first header name there, etc., etc. So great. So we're able now to get back all this data we want. However, there's a lot of noise in here, right? A lot of stuff we don't care about. Like we probably don't care about the background color and the padding, what the vertical alignment is, right? We really just care about the data here. So going back to the Google Sheets API, they actually have this feature called field masking, right? So list your desired fields that you want to get back here in the URL parameter. And you can see with reading a field mask here, this documentation is really good. We can explicitly list only the fields you need. And this also improves the performance of that API call, right? If we're calling less data, of course, it's going to be faster to respond. Of course, we could, work with all that data in Xano, but the less data that we start out with, right, the better things are going to be, because we only really ever want to work with what we need. So let's go ahead and explicitly list only the fields you need. And this documentation is is really good here. It has some examples of a response without field masking, and then field masking in the URL, what the response then looks like. I needed a little bit of trial and error to figure it out. It is definitely robust, but it takes some time to really understand this. So read this carefully if this is something that you're going to actually implement. I'm going to grab the field mask that I already tried out on my other screen here and come back to Xano. And if we go over into my API request again, and at the end of my URL, so after %s remember will be our spreadsheet ID. I'm going to paste this in. There's a parameter called fields. So it's question mark fields equals, and now I have sheets, and then you see there's some parentheses here because things start to get nested. Data, row data, values, formatted values. So what that's saying is we don't need to define result because we're always getting result back. But now, okay, on this level, only give us sheets, and then within sheets, only give us data, and then within data, only give us row data. Within values, only give us formatted value. So let me just double check that that's all in there. Great, let's save this. And if we rerun this, our response should look a lot slimmer now, and it already does. So now you can see in result, we get sheets, data, row data, values, and now in our values array, we just have all that row data, the formatted values that we actually care about. So this is already looking a lot better. Now we have, now we can work with just the data we want, and that also improves the response time of that Google Sheets API. So let's keep going, let's keep building. So let me actually rerun that real quick because I actually want to use that response. So something you've probably seen in Xano if you watched other tutorials or you're familiar with the platform is this thing called Subpath, and that allows us to work with even just the data we want, right? So we're getting this large response back. Of course, we have our request, response, these headers, all this nested stuff, and then down here we have our row data, which is really what we care about. So what I can do is I can copy this entire response, and let me create a brand new variable. And I'm just going to call this, I'll just call this data here. And if I choose this API1 value, but then click here on this right side, this subpath option, well, I can go ahead and actually paste in that response I copied and hit define. And now Xano allows me to visually keep expanding all of these paths to traverse exactly to the data that I want, right? So I probably want to work with all these values arrays because each one is row data. So I'm going to go ahead and select this row data. And Xano will actually populate this dot notation for me. And I can even get rid of these indexes because I want everything, not just the first item in those arrays. So my result will look like this. So if I hit save, and now let's update my response to just data and go ahead and rerun this. Well, now you can see that, okay, great. We're just getting all these values of every single row. So now we're even getting more fine-tuned into what data we need to work with. Now, of course, every Google Sheet, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, can be a lot of nuance, and this is really a base layer or foundational layer to get you started. But I'm going to show you something I see as common that might trip people up that we can fix very easily in Xano. So if I actually go back to my spreadsheet here, you can see that my spreadsheet starts at this top corner. But I've noticed sometimes people like to actually put some spacing in here, right? They like to give the spreadsheet or the data a little room to breathe, right? So they might start down here before they actually have their headers and whatnot. So if I run this in Xano, well, you can see right here, we get these couple empty objects here. And it does look a little weird, but it can also trip up our logic a little bit. But what's nice about Xano is we have a very easy filter to fix that. So I'm just going to add a filter here called filter empty. Hit update and save, and that'll just filter out those empty objects that we're seeing there. And now we should get a nice formatted list once again. But even though this is nice and gets rid of a lot of the noise that we don't need, this data is still not very easy to work with yet. So what I want to do is I actually want to start to create a JSON object or a list of JSON objects to actually, work with this data so we can add it to the Xano database, right? So you can see our headers here is in this first values array, and then we're moving down, and here's all our row data, our actual values. So let's actually start to create that. And if you've seen here, I'm just going to create a new variable here, but we have this filter called create object. So it creates object based on a list of keys and a list of values, right? And so let me just kind of pause this one right now. So we need to actually get that list of keys or list of headers first. And the way I'm going to do that is because we filtered out those empty values, it's really nice because we know our headers or our keys are going to be right on the top here, right? Let's look back at our sheet here. You can see even though there's spaces here, we're going to have our keys come back first because we're filtering out those empty values. So if I go to data manipulation in arrays and remove from beginning of array, this will just remove the first elements there. So my variable here will be my data, and the return variable, I'm going to call this headers. So not only is this going to update my data variable by removing it, but it's also going to create a new variable with just those what's being removed, which is going to be my headers, right? So let's go ahead and hit save here. And let me just put in a stop and debug here so you can start to see what that looks like. And let me just go ahead and select headers here. So if I run that and we hit the stop and debug, well, now you can see that we have, okay, our headers variable is just those, headers that we want. In data now looks different, right? So if we run that for data, this should now be updated where we have basically just the values now, which is really great. So now we're getting somewhere. So because we have this list of values, and what do we want to do? We want to start adding these to the database, create an object first, right? We're ready to now introduce a for each loop. So I'm just going to comment out that stop and debug. Let's go ahead and add our loop. So we're going to actually loop through everything in data right now, right? And let's hit save. And now let's actually go ahead and I'm ready for this create variable now. So let's first unhide this and let's open this up. So our value here is going to be from our headers variable, right? But headers has nested in there the value array and then formatted values. So we actually want to go ahead and say values dot formatted value as our path of headers. And then our values for create object will be, well, we're going to go ahead and select item, and we'll do that same thing. We'll just go ahead and say values dot formatted value. Let's hit save and update and save that. And let's actually go ahead and we'll go ahead and call this formatted object and just hit save. And let's bring that stop and debug back here into our loop so you can actually see what's going to happen for each item. So if we hit save and update and I rerun this, and this will just trigger a stop in the first item of the array. And look at that. Now we have this really nice formatted data. We have all our appropriate headers or keys and the values that all go in the spot that they should go. So now I'm ready to start adding this to my database table. So let's go down here and add a add record request. And I've already set up my leads table here with the appropriate fields. You can see I don't have an index field. I felt like that wasn't necessary because I have this ID field in Xano, but I have everything else. Now I can easily apply everything from that formatted object to Xano, and I'll choose the flexible default values. One thing though to note is in my response here, in my fields in my spreadsheet, right, I have things like account space ID, but we know in the Xano database we have the underscore, right, because we can't have spaces in the DB. So I'll just need to go through and fix that very simply. I can do that, and so I won't bore you going through all this. I'll quickly do this and come back. Okay, great. So I've updated all these paths to match what's going to be here in this formatted object. to account for those little bit different in format with the space and underscore. So we should be ready to go now, right? Well, let's talk about one more additional nuance that you might run into, right? So this format's all great if your data, if there's data present in every column, right, for each row. But for example, what happens if, let's go back to our spreadsheet here. What happens if we don't have, let's say, a lead owner, right? And this could be obviously more than one field. Let's see, and I still have the stop in debug. Let's make sure that's above my add record. So let's go ahead and look at what that format is actually going to look like. So you can see my lead owner now is empty, but it's an empty object. Now, why is that a problem? Well, if we're trying to add this to our database, right, and I can go ahead and just comment out my stop and debug, well, you'll see we're going to run into an error. And what does that say? So lead owner text filter requires a scalar value. That means that we have a mismatch of data types, right? We're trying to shove in an object into a text field, right? So those data types don't match. So we need to actually correct for that. So how can we do that? So there is a couple ways we can do that. I'm going to show you an inline way on the add record that we can do to make it fairly simple. So for here in my lead owner, we would need to apply this for every field, but I can add an additional filter. And we're looking for, it's going to be called set conditional, right? And so set conditional allows us to these mini little conditionals inline. So here I can go ahead and say the conditional down here, we can say if we will have formatted object, we would say dot lead owner. And let me make sure here, lead owner, that's all capitalized. And then we'd add a filter here and we would say is object update. So this set conditional, what this will do is it's going to say, okay, if formatted object dot lead owner is an object, if that's equal to true, then we can update it with a value here. And my value will, I can just make it an empty string. For example, let's hit update and let's hit save. And now let's actually just move this run and debug down here. And let's see what the result is with leads one. So let's go ahead and rerun this. And now you can see that actually what happens is Xano was able to evaluate that, okay, look, this field is actually an object. Let's update that to make it just an empty string, and it put the right value in there that's needed. So you might be asking, why couldn't we use that filter empty filter like we did up here? Well, the issue is if we happen to use that, well, that's actually going to push all those values up a level, right? Because those empty values get filtered out. So now we will have things like, we would have first name, this Jeffrey value here in lead owner. Vincent is the last name, would be on first name. Company would be the last name. Phone one would be the company. So our data would start to be in the wrong order, and no one wants that, right? So this is putting us in a very good place here. Now, of course, you know, having to put that on every single value line can get a little annoying. However, the alternative does involve introducing another for each loop. So I do quickly want to show how you would do that in case you don't, if you're adapting this to your own use case, and say you have so many fields in here that you don't want to have to go and do set conditional, set conditional, set conditional, because you might have a lot of empty values. The for each loop will be just another option that you can have here. So what I'm going to do here is let's introduce it. Let's actually first just kind of hide this guy here. And let's do a loop here, say for each loop. And we need to loop through, item and dot values dot formatted value here. I'll hit this check mark and let's just call this singular value. So I'll hit save and I'm going to drag this up to the top here. And so we need to go ahead and look through each value in that list, right? And we need to say, okay, data manipulation conditional. We need to say if value, and we can say is an object, right, is equal to true. Hit update and save. Well, then we need to go ahead and update a variable. And we just need to update our value, which is in the loop, just to basically nothing, just like that. And so once we do that, then we can go ahead and actually go through and update, or go ahead and create that variable. And let's just go ahead and look how that looks. So formatted object, let's hit save and let's rerun this. So we should see something very similar. And remember, because this is empty, what we're getting back in that external API request down here is this empty object. So we're just updating that to be just a blank value, so it doesn't throw a wrench in our data. So what this does is it will search through all of these as for each loop and apply that conditional. So it's just two different methods versus down here where we're doing it in line on each one. In the snippet, I'll include both options, and I'll have this second one, or this second for each loop, hidden, and then you can make that call or decision sort of which one you want to actually go about implementing. So great, let's go back to my sample spreadsheet here, and I'm just going to do, let's see if Command Z will bring back Christy McKee. Okay, awesome. So now that we have Christy McKee back, I'm going to go ahead and remove that stop and debug. Let's bring back my add record in here. We don't actually need a response, and let's go ahead into my leads database, and let's just clear this out, and we'll reset my primary ID back to 1 here. Awesome. So back to my function, and let's actually go ahead and run this now. Let's make sure I don't have any stop and debugs marked anywhere, but this should be good to go. So let's go ahead and give this a run and see what happens. Awesome, so it ran, and you can see I got this message, debugger encountered an error. This is a really great teaching point. I'm glad this happened. So you can see that I included the variable details during the run. That means each step is printing out all of the data, right? And I have 1,000 records in there. There's a lot going on, right? That initial API call has tons of stuff in it, then we kind of, shave it down, etc. So an error occurred because the debugger variable details may be taking up too much memory. This can happen when there's a lot of data, loops, complexity in the function stack. So obviously I'm working with a lot of data. That just means that all that stuff printed out in the debugger, I'm not going to see, but the function actually still ran, right? So if I check my database and I go down here, well, great. I have all my 1,000 leads and it looks like all the data's in there. Let's clear this up again, and I'll show you how to run that so you don't run into that error, because it's a very common thing, right? The debugger only has so much information to hold into. So let me actually also just publish this real quick. But if I go to run this now and I just uncheck this to include the variable details and hit run, voila. So this is what it looks like this time. See, I have success. It says no, I'm not returning anything. It even ran faster because it's not having to load up that debugger. And if you look at my debugger, well, I can still see the timings and everything. Of course, you can see the longest thing to run was that for each loop, right? And if I go to my database, well, here are my 1,000 records. So one other thing I want to just quickly touch on is, why did I build this in a function? Well, working with this much data is really designed to be used in background tasks, right? You wouldn't want to actually do this through an API call. Background tasks are designed to process a large amount of data like this. Of course, I'm using a spreadsheet with 1,000 leads. Your spreadsheet might be bigger, right? Have more columns or even more rows of data. You might also want to double check the Google Sheets API. Like, let's say you have 1 million records. It probably won't, the Google Sheets API probably won't be able to return you 1 million records all at once, and that will also cause memory issues with doing a for each loop. So you might want to look at if there's a way to page some of the data with Google Sheets if you're dealing with anything that large, so you can do things recursively. However, this is really designed, like I said, to be in a background task. So I'll just go ahead and say background task here. We'll say add records. What I would do next is I would just simply come into my custom functions and add that Google Sheet API function, right? And I would run this however often, right? Maybe I want to run this, every night at midnight, right? So I could come in here, I could select midnight basically, and this would run, every night at midnight. So when, at my desk in the morning when I log on, well, all my data will be in Xano. But let's talk about one more use case here. And I'm going to make one edit to this Google Sheet API. This is great if you're adding records, but we're calling the same spreadsheet all the time, right? So maybe sometimes that record's actually being updated, right? And we need to just update those records. So what I might want to do instead of an add record in here, I might actually want to do an add or edit record, right? And so add or edit record is really great because it will do one of two things, right? We will pick a field to look up a record on, right? For example, in this leads test, I would do something like account ID or email, something that's going to be unique that we have, right? Of course, I removed the index from there, but if you have like an index or ID that maps to Xano perfectly, that's perfect. This account ID is a very good candidate to look up a record uniquely. But what it's going to do, it's going to say, okay, well, let's say account ID. Our field value here would be formatted object dot account ID, right? And they'll say, okay, if I find that account ID, well, let's update it with the latest and greatest. If I don't find this account ID in my database, let's add a new record, right? So that way, if you have leads that, who knows, the thing like the phone number or the lead owner is changing, right? That will get updated. But if you're getting 100 new leads a day, well, those are still coming in. So it's really a very flexible function. And let's go ahead and add the formatted object in here. And then I'll just go ahead and delete those or add those spaces and delete those underscores. Great. So now just looking, I updated all these paths to match that formatted object variable, right? Because my database has an underscore, the variable doesn't. So those are all looking great now. So let's put this add or edit record into actual practice now, right? So let's quickly just look at my database here. And let's go ahead and, say we have a new lead owner. It's not Christy McKee anymore for record 1. Let's go ahead and say it's myself and make sure to update that. So if we run this, we should still have 1,000 records, right? I didn't add anything new, but if we hit that function again, well, it should make the appropriate update. So let's go ahead and give it a run. And voila. All right, so let's check our database and we should see that the lead owner for record number 1 has been updated to Michael. So I'll leave that in the snippet, that add or edit record function, but just know the difference there between just initially adding data or adding or editing data. It's a very, very handy function. Now, of course, I'll include the set conditional method here in this function, but then I'll also leave this option here hidden so that you can start to adapt this to whatever use case you might have. Remember, there might be a lot of nuance depending on the structure of your Google Sheet or how it's formatted or how much data is in there. But this should be a really nice, once again, just base layer foundation to get you started, and you can adapt it. Of course, I definitely recommend using the stop and debug method, especially on the external API requests, to see how your different Google Sheets are going to actually affect how the response comes back. And then you can start to shape your Xano function stack based on what's actually needed. So there you are. I know that was a long video, but I wanted to go step by step because there is so much nuance here, and you'll probably need to adapt this to your specific Google spreadsheet, right? Maybe not necessarily one size fits all, but a great foundation. Once again, started with the Google Service account, separate tutorial on that, but we set that up so we're actually authenticating. You could actually, if you have a launch plan and above, turn on response caching here. I think the token's good for an hour, so you could maybe do every 30 minutes, so you're not necessarily calling that every time. We went through, called Google Sheet API, right? We used the field masking to just get the data we want. We were able to create a formatted object and also filter out if there's any empty rows, of course, and then also adjust for any empty cells in our rows of data that might affect anything. Last but not least, remember, working with a lot of data like this is designed to be put in a background task to process all that data over longer periods of time. Depending on the size of your Google Sheet, please check Google Sheet documentation for something like paging. You don't want to be trying to shove in, millions of records at a time. Things are just not going to work for, the Sheets API or, getting it into even Xano. So there's probably some paging that you could use to do things recursively, and then you can get all your data in. So that's not a problem. But once again, hope this was helpful. Know a lot of people, a lot of no-coders love Google Sheet API. It's definitely a really great resource. There's even more you can do with this API. It's not just getting data, right? You can read, create, update, whole lot of functionality. So hopefully this is some encouragement to get you started or help you on your way to building more with Xano and Google Sheet API. Thank you all for watching, and see you all in the next video.